Welcome again to AP European History. Continuing in Unit 6, we're going to talk about nationalism. We've mentioned it several times already. We've actually, since the beginning of this course, we've been touching on nationalism and the rise of nationalism. But in the 1800s, nationalism takes on a very particular definition and will ultimately be one of the driving forces behind World War I. So let's get right into this question of what is a nation to someone in the 1800s. And of course, looking at this map, we've looked at it before, is Austria-Hungary a nation? They didn't call themselves a nation, they were an empire. Can something that has this many ethnic groups be a nation? And ultimately, that will be one of the questions. That will be the downfall of Austria-Hungary. So, the Congress of Vienna, which we last left off with, is one of those things that helped breed, and the Napoleonic Wars, breed this question of what is a nation. We talked about the military humiliation of Prussia, the humiliation of almost every nation in Europe by the French, and the rise of nationalism in answer to that. And it will lead to these other ideas of the 19th century, irredentism and revanchism. Irredentism is going to come from the Italians, who, as you can see in this map, in northern Italy, those areas of blue were given in the Congress of Vienna to the Austrian Empire, and Italians started seeing this as nationalism grew in Italy as Italia irredente. That is the unredeemed Italy, the part of Italy that needs to be redeemed. It needs to be back as part of Italy. Revanchism will become a French expression that will relate to their loss of Alsace and Lorraine in 1870. It comes from revenge. They need revenge for that. They have to get back their land. So land is going to be a very, very important part of what is 19th century nationalism and who controls what land and who is in charge of that land. All right, so let's get to it. 19th century, the common definition of that time is this idea. It's not patriotism. It's not love of nation. It's the idea of a nation as a unique people joined together by a common language, common customs, culture, a history, homeland, religion. All of those things kind of put together is what makes a people. And that people should have a nation. And if they don't have a nation, then they need to stir up some nationalism until they can get a nation. You can see that even today in modern Europe, they're still trying to come to terms with what is nation, as Great Britain has left the EU, and as all of the nations of the European Union have closed their borders in answer to the crisis over COVID-19. Another important part of this is self-determination. It's one thing, like Hungary, which was a nation controlled by the Austrian emperor, but they should also be self-determined. They should rule by themselves, free from outside influence or outside rulers. So, yes, Hungary was a discrete part of the Austrian Empire and kind of a nation under the Habsburg emperor, but the Habsburg emperor was not Hungarian. He was Austrian. And so that would not fit into what is a true nation. A nation should be, a Hungarian nation should be ruled by a Hungarian. It will be the Prussians who do a lot of the groundwork for nationalism. We've alluded to this before. Some of the Romantics, a lot of the writers in the late Enlightenment and during the time of the French Revolution, like Johann Gottfried Herder, who stressed the importance of a common language to a nation. And that's one of those things that we're still wrestling with today, like in Canada. Can they be a truly bilingual country, especially the province of Quebec? Or, like many Quebecis believe, that we need to leave. We need to create our own country. That we speak French. We can't be part of a country that mostly speaks English. Then the Prussian philosopher Johann Fichte, who is the one who originally created the idea that we talked about with Hegel, with the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Hegel's usually given credit for it because he kind of popularized it. Well, he came up with that. And he will be At first, he was a huge defender of the French Revolution. He loved the ideals of the French Revolution, these liberal ideas of freedom, Enlightenment ideals. But then ultimately, he saw the French Revolution turn into an empire, and he gave up on the French. He's like, the French can't carry the torch of the Enlightenment. So he gives a series of speeches in 1807, 1808, the addresses to the German nation, in which he lays out that it's up to the German nation to create an empire of reason. So it's up to the Germans to carry this torch of the Enlightenment and to carry the Enlightenment to the German people. He will also spend some time talking about what is this German nation? How do we define this German nation? And for him, this idea of the Volk, a word we're familiar with, if you know what a Volkswagen is, it's the people's car. The idea of Hitler creating a car for the common people. But the Volk is just a German word meaning people. We also use it as the word Volk. But he saw it very much as the people are an expression of the history of the people. And which strongly implies that if you don't share the history of a nation, you can't ever truly be a part of that nation. All of this ideas of nation based upon language and customs and culture and history leads to huge questions of like, well, what about immigration? Can immigrants ever become a part of that if they're bringing their own ethnicity with them? And especially the strong nationalists of the 19th century would have to say, no, they cannot. They have a completely different understanding of the world, and they can never truly be part of your nation because a nation is made up of the people and their history. So this is, again, 19th century nationalism. The Congress of Vienna, not big fans of nationalism. The Congress of Vienna says that a legitimate monarchy is the basis of government, which is why they restored monarchies or expanded monarchies in Prussia, in the Netherlands, and restored the French monarchy, restored the Spanish monarchy. Had nothing to do with ethnic groups, had nothing to do with self-determination, has nothing to do with nations choosing what kind of government they were. So in this specific regard, conservatism battled nationalism. That conservatism sees nationalism as a major threat because nationalism undermines this basis of government. However, that's not always true. And we're going to end up here in this lesson. Tsar Nicholas I is going to embrace nationalism, especially Russian nationalism and the Russian motherland, as key to preserving his power as the ruler of Russia. Which is interesting because he was not only the emperor of Russia, but he was also the king of Poland. So how is he going to keep that going? So how does this grow? How does this idea probably... So we know it's deeply inspired by the French Revolution and the wars of the French Revolution and the humiliation of much of Europe. But ultimately, a lot of it's going to come from historians and other elites, other academic elites, linguists in particular, studying language, historians, folk historians, studying the history of a people, start talking about the people, the Volk, and who they are and what their spirit is, the Volkgeist of the people. And it will ultimately be teachers, usually college professors, who will spread the idea. And many college professors, especially in Prussia, will get shut down, sometimes arrested. But other times, you can see in this school painting from 1887, that it was the teachers who were actively spreading the idea of nationalism. This is a painting shortly after France had lost the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And it shows a teacher pointing at the black stain, which is the two provinces on the map of France at the front of the classroom, but they've been painted over with black. It's a humiliation to France. And until those are restored, until France has its revanche, then there can be no true France. And you can see in particular the student who is called to the front of the classroom is wearing a military uniform. All right, so one of the big battlegrounds of nationalism is language. It would be one of the biggest battlegrounds, but it didn't really start here in the 19th century. If you recall, going back to the Renaissance and Reformation, most elite writing, academic writing, was done in Latin, right? However, part of the Renaissance and then the Reformation will be an emphasis on the vernacular, writing things in the language of the common people. So Dante writes the Divine Comedy in Italian. You have our good friend Martin Luther making a translation of the Bible into German. What changes is language becoming a determiner of what nation you belong to. And as a force, the government uses to impose unity. We talked about during the Reformation that many kings, many monarchs saw multiple religions as a threat to their authority, a threat to unity. Well, language becomes the same issue. France will begin imposing, especially after the revolution of Napoleon III, official forms of national language. They'll even use the biblical incident of the Tower of Babel to show that this is a terrible thing. We have to snuff out these other languages within our country and have everyone use official French language. The Italians will attempt to do much the same thing. Wasn't highly effective, especially this time, because honestly they didn't have the technology or the public school systems to force that on everyone. But they will, at least in the public, they'll ban forms of language other than official French or official Italian. And then there's a strange attempt by linguists of the time to attempt to go back and trace the history of a language to find its earliest, purest form of that language. And believing that is the closest to the true form of German, especially in Eastern Europe or Scandinavian countries, or the purest form of Swedish. Becomes more of an obsession with the history of a language and where it came from and how it relates to other languages. And maybe some ethnicities are actually brothers in language. Print culture will be a key part of attempting to create national unity, but it can only go so far. We'll ultimately really see linguistic unity become a much bigger part in European countries after the advent of public schools, but especially radio, organizations like the BBC and TV. So a lot of the old, if not, alternative languages in Great Britain die out, but a lot of just the accents will disappear. The accents that pre-World War II, you'd walk 3 blocks in London and you'd hear different accents completely. Those will disappear as more and more people adopt official BBC accents. And so today, yes, there are different accents in places like France, Great Britain, but they're not nearly as stark as they had been. I mean, there were times in England, if you went from Cornwall up to Northumberland, those two people might have difficulty actually communicating with each other. And something really to think about in terms of language and unity. Europe, when we started this course, had been unified by Latin and the Roman Catholic Church. That there was a sense of European culture, of shared European history, shared European things, including their religion. And the Reformation, the Renaissance shattered that. They shattered the monopoly of Latin. They shattered the monopoly of the Roman Church into much more individualistic enterprises. So the question to think about is the Reformation, Renaissance, were those ultimately good in terms of European stability and peace? Or did it set the foundation for unending nationalistic wars or nationalistic conflicts that we're still seeing in parts of Europe today? Although by and large, those have settled down, we're still seeing regions of Spain want to break away. Regions of Belgium want to break away. Scotland now talking about breaking away from the United Kingdom because the United Kingdom has broken away from the European Union. Will this ever end? Or is there a way to create another sense of European unity? And that's what the European Union has been, is this grand experiment in creating a secular European identity without religion and even without language. But just a European identity that embraces differences. I'll let you answer that later. All right, problems with nationalism. So one of the fundamental problems is, well, where does your nation end? Is it when you get into a town where your people speak 51% of the 51% of the people speak your language? Or Well, what happened to the other 49%? So say it's a town that 51% speak German and 49% speak French. What happens to those 49% who speak French? Must they convert to German, or must they leave? Must they get kicked out? And in Alsace-Lorraine, you will see people forcibly leaving their region because now they're going to be forced to be part of the German state as opposed to the French state where they wanted to be. Where does your nation end and another one pick up? And we're going to find in many parts of Europe, especially post-World War II, efforts at ethnic cleansing. The idea is you wipe out everybody different than your group in that area by either forcing them to leave or by literally killing them. That's an issue that, again, if language and culture is what your nation is, then how can you tolerate those who are different? It's why the Turks will do the Armenian genocide. It's why Hitler will do the Holocaust. Hitler was trying to purify his nation of what he saw as non-Germans. So this is a major problem with nationalism, is its inability to see anything as different as belonging to you. Also, which groups get nations? Which groups are big enough or have enough people who speak the language? Do Basques in Spain get their own nation? Do Walloons in Belgium get their nation? Do the Welsh get a nation? How about the settlers in Cornwallians? The people who live in Cornwall in England, do they get a nation? And if you do that, ultimately, don't you just eventually get to the point where you have thousands of tiny little nations of people? There's this big question: is there something other than history and language that can unify a people as a nation? And maybe the concept of nation, which is, again, one of the precepts of the EU and globalists, nation, it needs to be gotten rid of. We should get rid of the idea of nation completely and instead be unified by our common humanity. Many would also argue that when you look at the United States, does it prove this concept, this 19th century concept of nationalism, a false ideology? Because here, existing in the 1800s, was the United States of America, a nation made up of almost every European ethnicity, plus native ethnicities and African ethnicities, and by the late 1800s, Asian ethnicities, that had a strong national identity as early as the War of 1812, when there was a huge outpouring of patriotic nationalism and the national anthem is created. So is it possible to move beyond this in a way that is diverse and tolerant and yet still has a national identity? What is the United States? What is an American? Historians have been asking that about the United States even in colonial times, when Europeans would come there and say, what is this new thing? What is an American? How do you define that? Especially when you look at in the context of European nationalism, they're like, well, we know what a German is. It's someone who speaks German and has German parents. But what is an American? Do they speak American and eat Big Macs? There will also be a lot of problem areas, a lot of areas where nationalism becomes a problem either for the current rulers or for future rulers. Ireland, which had been controlled by the English for a very long time, is going to be a thorn in England's side. I'm not sure quite why they were so desperate to keep it. In 1844, Benjamin Disraeli, addressing Parliament, says it's got a dense population. It's in extreme distress because of the potato famine. There's an established church, which is not their church. In other words, the Anglican Church was the official church of Ireland, but they're all Catholics. And a territorial aristocracy, that is the people who run the place, they don't live there. They live in foreign capitals. Thus, we have a starving population, an absentee aristocracy, an alien church, and in addition, the weakest executive in the world. That's the Irish question. What do we do with this thing? And the English are going to struggle for this for a very long time. It will become quite violent and quite messy. Germany, they come out of the Holy Roman Empire falling apart. What is Germany going to be? Will there be two Germanys, Prussia and Austria? The Austrian Empire, while Austria is wanting to gain control of the future of Germany, you have Austria also dealing with the fact that they are made up of at least a half a dozen major ethnicities, 3 major religions, and dozens of lesser ethnicities. Well, that sounds wrong. Of smaller ethnic groups. How do they keep that empire together if nationalism gets close? The Austrians were terrified of nationalism. Italy, which was trying to develop its own national identity. Pretty much everywhere in the Balkans, because most of that's the Austrian Empire, the rest of it's the Ottoman Empire, or the Russian Empire, and none of them like being under the Russians or the Ottomans or the Austrians. Poland, which had been erased and then recreated as the Kingdom of Poland, but their king was the Tsar of Russia. The Netherlands had been expanded into this much bigger Netherlands by the Congress of Vienna, and the Belgians are like, we really don't like being under the King of the Netherlands. And then over time, over the next 100 years, this idea of nationalism spreads and becomes an issue where no one had even given it a thought before. We'll see, for example, the growth of Zionism by the end of the 1800s. The idea that, well, maybe Jews should have their own country. It'll spread to the colonies, places like India, which not really unified even by an ethnicity. India is such a large and diverse place with dozens of languages. But they will develop an identity that will press for independence from Great Britain based upon a national identity. In South Africa, the African National Congress, again, a lot of times the organizations that are pushing for independence put national in their name, like the African National Congress, that they want independence from Great Britain. And so colonies will ultimately rebel based upon nationalistic ideals. The Vietnamese, when they rebel against the French, will be based upon a nationalistic concept of Vietnam. Liberalism, we've talked about it before. We're just going to run through it quickly. Liberalism was hated by conservatives. Conservatives usually called anyone liberal a radical. They were the ones who we've already talked about. They questioned the status quo. They questioned the way things are, and they'd come from the Enlightenment. They wanted to use scientific ideals in order to impose this new utopian vision of society in using these basic ideas, what's sometimes called the Principles of 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which we read in class, freedom of the press, religious toleration, legitimate government comes from the consent of the governed, representative government, that is, there's some kind of body that people can vote to, like parliament, written constitutions, protections for individual liberties. All of these were basic ideas that liberals embraced. The weird thing is, in Europe, in no place did this exist in 1815. England and France were the closest, but even in England and France, you didn't see, especially those last two, written constitutions or individual liberties. Well, the French had constitutions, they kept rewriting them. They kept writing new constitutions and having kings, and it was a mess. The only place it really existed in the world was the United States. That list right there, that's the United States. Who were these people? They were the educated middle class. Marx would probably call them bourgeoisie. They tended to be the wealthier middle class. They were professionals, but they could also be academics. They were theorists, historians. But they felt excluded from the political process because while they now had economic power, they didn't have political power. They didn't have the right to vote oftentimes. Or they might be in a country where there was no thing like parliament that people could be voted to. At the same time, they didn't want to extend these freedoms and democracy to the lower classes. They didn't like the lower classes. They didn't like the working classes. Those were the true radicals, according to liberals. They wanted economic revolution. And liberals don't necessarily want this type of economic revolution like Marx did. A form of this liberalism, sometimes called economic liberalism or classical liberalism, based upon the writings of Adam Smith, we've talked about it before, wanted to abolish mercantilism. Basically, anything that restricted trade, anything that restricted economic freedoms should be done away with. And it all came from this basic premise that economic freedom benefits everybody because it frees people up to do those things that they are best doing and make trades on the open market to get the best product at the best price. Allows nations to do what they are best at. Finally, conservatism review. We talked about this in a previous lesson. Just want to make sure you remember, conservatism was those 3 pillars coming out of the Congress of Vienna in the 1800s. Established churches, legitimate monarchies, and landed aristocracies, the nobility. Those are the things that keep the peace. Conservatism was based upon preserving the status quo. because the revolution and the Napoleonic Wars had been so disruptive and so disruptive and destructive that they wanted to make sure that never happened again. So any type of change is dangerous. So we'll keep these things in place, we'll defend them, and we'll do whatever we have to do to advance their control, because they believe that would be good for everybody. That stability is to everyone's benefit. And we talked about a little bit about Edmund Burke, this guy over the right, who believed very strongly that traditions come down to us because they've been tried through history and they've been found to be valuable to people. And we shouldn't just attack and throw out traditions just because we don't want to do what our parents say or our grandparents did. All right, last thing, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but these three isms, nationalism, liberalism, and conservatism, do they all get along, or is it just a giant cage match the entire century? Well, it turns out liberalism and conservatism generally don't get along. Nationalism is used by both sides when it's convenient and depending upon the situation in the area. Austria-Hungary, conservative, definitely not nationalistic. But then you look over to Russia, conservative, but super nationalistic, even though they also had a lot of ethnic groups. They had a lot more ethnic unity in that Russia was the predominant ethnicity, was the majority ethnicity, and the idea was to use that Russian nationality and even the Russian church to reinforce this idea of unity and obedience to Tsar Nicholas. We'll talk more about Tsar Nicholas later. Sometimes liberals are super nationalistic, as they will be oftentimes in Germany, in Prussia. But the conservative monarchs hated the liberals, so because they hated the liberals, they also tried to crush nationalism, or only do nationalism in a way that they wanted to do it. So, that's nationalism, liberalism, and conservatism. We will see you next time.